Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. July Pilowsky today as the very first speaker in our scientific seminar series. Dr. Pilowsky is an ecological modeler. They have a very wide-ranging background, and rather than describing them as system agnostic, I will describe them as being system inclusive. They've worked on lots of systems. They began their academic career getting a bachelor's at Columbia University in the E3B department working on European starlings. They went on to do a master's at Tufts University looking at the behavioral ecology of paper wasps. And in between the master's and the PhD, they did a fellowship year at the Max Planck Institute of Demographic Research, creating some software to understand better time series and ecological time series and removing the temporal autocorrelation from those data sets. And then for their PhD, they decided to move continents again and went to do a joint program between Denmark and Australia, between the University of Copenhagen and the University of Adelaide. And you'll hear all about some of that research in today's seminar. And I've really enjoyed working with July Pilowsky in our research group over the past couple of months, I guess, where they are applying some of their exceptional creative modeling talents to some of the complex questions that we're trying to understand in infectious disease ecology and what factors contribute to those complexities in a sort of structured and very clear thinking kind of a way, building those processes into models. Without further ado, I'll let you take it away, July.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about the PhD thesis I defended earlier this year. It's called Revealing Ecological Processes of Range Dynamics Through Space and Time. I did this with my advisors, Damien Fordham at the University of Adelaide and Karsten Robeck at the University of Copenhagen. As is traditional in Australia, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I did most of my research. And I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also wanted to clarify something real quick about the joint PhD program, since I've gotten a lot of questions on this. The way that it worked was that I spent 1 year in Copenhagen, Denmark, and 3 years in Adelaide, Australia. And I just had regular Zoom calls with whichever advisor I wasn't with. Along the way, you'll just see a bar along the top of the screen that just shows how far along I am in the talk, so you can use that to guide your way. We have lost 58% of all megafaunal species since the last ice age. Here we see a breakdown by continent of percentage of species lost. And many of the megafaunal species that remain have small population sizes or limited ranges. Why should we care about this, beyond, of course, the inherent value of biodiversity? Well, megafauna have a lot of impacts on the ecosystems they're a part of. One is on the vegetation community. Megafauna are ecosystem engineers, and they can change the vegetation community in significant ways. For example, they can convert forest to grassland, as shown in this nice ecotone picture. Megafauna can also affect the soil structure. Here we see a bison having a nice wallow. When megafauna have these sort of dust baths, they overturn layers of soil, which I'm sure the soil scientists in this room could tell you has a big impact. When we lose megafauna species, we affect the trophic structure. Often there are many links to megafauna in food webs. And another impact is nutrient cycling. Megafauna can disperse very long distances. When they consume food in one place and they travel to another place, they bring nutrients with them from one place to another. So it's thought that the loss of megafauna has really reduced nutrient cycling in a lot of ecosystems. So then the question becomes, how did this happen? How did we lose so many species of megafauna since the late Pleistocene? Well, to do this, let's zoom in a little bit on a couple of examples. Here we have the woolly rhinoceros and the woolly mammoth. Here we have KYRBP means kilo years before present, so this would be 42,000 years ago, etc. So we can see that both of these species used to have a huge distribution. Perhaps if you were a human living at this time, you might have thought they could never possibly go extinct if you knew how large their range was. But over the course of not very long, geologically speaking, from 21,000 to 6,000 years ago, They both experienced an enormous range collapse. So the woolly rhinoceros became totally extinct, and the woolly mammoth was restricted to just a few little Alaskan islands. So this really draws into sharp relief how big of a change has occurred in megafauna since the last ice age. So one change that's happened over the course of this time since the last ice age is the range of humans has expanded enormously. Homo sapiens used to be restricted to southern Africa, expanded out through Eurasia into Oceania, and very rapidly through the Americas. And that was, of course, bringing many pressures on other species with us, such as land use change and hunting. Now, that on its own might seem like enough to explain all of these megafaunal losses. However, there's another huge change that's happened since the end of the ice age, which is that there's been massive, massive climatic change. Now, right now, the amount of global warming we're going through here, we're quite concerned about having had 1 degree Celsius of change globally, and it's had a lot of effects that we've all observed on our climate, and it's definitely a big deal. But there was an even larger change in the average global temperature that occurred since the last ice age. So, of course, a change in 7 degrees Celsius globally could have a huge impact on species ranges. So the question becomes, how do we disentangle the effects of these different drivers on species ranges? Because there's interactions between these two factors. Global warming itself facilitated the expansion of the human range over the course of this time. So for me, the answer to how I did this was through a technique called process-explicit modeling. I'm going to get into more detail later about what exactly a process-explicit model is, but I'll just give a little brief overview right now. Process-explicit models are also called mechanistic models, and they represent the dynamics of ecological systems as explicit functions of the biological processes and global change drivers that produce them. So for example, the process-explicit models that I built included population growth and movement as processes, and climate change and human harvesting as drivers. Though in theory, you could have a lot of different processes and drivers in a process-explicit model. With my process-explicit models, I included a lot of different data sources to make them work. I parameterized these models using data from paleoclimate models, carbon-14 dated fossils, and data sets on land use change over time. I also used a lot of different data sources for validation. So I also used carbon-14 dated fossils for that. I used genetic evidence from ancient DNA, and I used historical records. Process-explicit models can produce a bunch of different outputs. The outputs that I got from my models included distributions. So these are presence-absence maps of where a species is found or not found, and spatially explicit abundances. So that is an abundance of organisms in each grid cell on a map. This is something quite special. So species distribution models, which are another approach to modeling species ranges, they can produce distributions, but they can't really produce spatially explicit abundances. They can produce probability of occurrence, but that's not the same thing as an abundance. So with all of that in mind, here are the research questions that I tackled during my doctoral research. First, how can process-explicit models be used to conserve biodiversity? Second, how can we improve the accuracy of process-explicit models of human migration? Third, how did the steppe bison become extinct in Siberia? And fourth, how did the European bison become extinct in the wild? The way these kind of fit together is that the first chapter was basically a review paper about the state of process-explicit models in ecology and where they can go from here. The second chapter, I had to do a lot of process-explicit modeling of human abundance in order to inform my megafauna extinction models. And over the course of doing that work, I found a lot of uncertainty in my forecasts of human range expansion. So I thought, how can we improve that and reduce the uncertainty? And then I applied that toward chapters 3 and 4, where I look at two megafaunal species. One is an extinct species of bison, and one is a living species of bison. Chapter 1, how can process-explicit models be used to conserve biodiversity? You can read about this in much more detail in our paper that came out last year in Science Advances. So that's down here. You can take a picture if you want. Let's return to the topic of what is a process-explicit model anyway. I often find it easiest to explain process-explicit models by contrast with what they aren't, which is a correlative model. So a correlative model is used a lot in ecology. It's where you find a statistical relationship between two variables. And this is what you might think of as a process-implicit model, because there is a process implied that links these two variables, but we don't necessarily know what it is, and we don't necessarily know what direction the causation goes in. So a correlative model can be incredibly useful for generating hypotheses. You can see a relationship between two variables and think, well, why are these two things related? So is one of them causing the other? How does that work? And that lets you get deeper into processes and something you could answer experimentally. So correlative models have their use and process and implicit models have their use. But once you understand a system better and you have enough data, then you can start using process-explicit models. So in a process-explicit model, we specify and postulate causal processes that cause whatever ecological pattern that we're interested in. And there's a bunch of different ecological processes we could use. Here I've arranged them in terms of timescale, so going clockwise from shortest timescale to longest timescale of ecological process. When I did my review of this literature, I found that early process-explicit models tended to focus on shorter timescale processes like movement and extinction. But over time, there's been more and more inclusion of processes that operate over longer timescales, like speciation. I think that's an important stride forward. Another thing I'd like to point out about process-explicit models and what they can do that other approaches can't do is that process-explicit models can be used to explore counterfactual scenarios. If you make a model using a bunch of different processes interacting with one another, what you can do is you can turn one process off and you run the model again and you see if you still get your pattern without that process. And if that happens, that indicates that that process isn't necessary to cause the pattern that you're looking at. So counterfactual scenarios can be really good for establishing how causality works in your system. I'm going to talk about a few examples of process-explicit models I encountered in my review that just kind of show the diversity of different ways that you can use these models. I think are quite interesting. So on the level of genetic diversity, this is a process-explicit coalescent model that was used on an endangered wildflower, Penstemon diustus. And what this group did is that they looked at genetic diversity of this plant in the past. They reconstructed that using genetic samples from different subpopulations of the plant and how that was affected by past climate change. And then they used that to inform a process-explicit model going into the future under future climate conditions. And they were able to predict how that will affect the genetic diversity of the species into the future. That's quite interesting because it's, it incorporates connectivity between populations and all these important processes that you might not get at through a simple correlative climate approach. Another one is this physiological model of the American pika. It's a nice little mammal found in the American West. This model is basically based on based on the physiology of the animal. And they actually predicted a larger range into the future than is predicted by species distribution models because they included the ability of the animal to behaviorally thermoregulate. They found that there's some areas where they'll be able to persist because of their ability to change the hours when they're active or use of shade and that sort of thing. And then on the level of ecosystem diversity, there's plenty of people here at Cary who do process-explicit ecosystem models. This study is an agroecosystem model hindcasting the agricultural productivity of the Provence Valley over the course of the Holocene. And this is quite an interesting study because it looks at how agricultural productivity was affected by abrupt climate change in the Holocene, which gives us some idea of how abrupt climate change might affect agricultural productivity in the future. So there's a lot of ways you can apply these within ecology. The approach that I did is just one approach out of many that could be done. So how can process-explicit models be improved? There's some trends I saw in the literature that I thought were notable. Like I said, there's a trend toward incorporating longer timescales. Early process-explicit models tended to look at extinction over the course of decades. I have now, more recently seen process-explicit models of diversification within clades, speciation, which go for millions of years. So that's incredibly interesting to start to think about these processes over very long periods of time. There's also movement toward finer temporal resolution of adaptation and speciation. As we get better and better genetic evidence, more fine-scale genetic evidence, it's possible to understand how these processes of, say, adaptation can occur over the course of centuries, not just millennia. There's also, I think it's really important to move toward meta-community models. There's a lot of meta-population models that are process-explicit in the literature. But I think looking at communities on the landscape and how they exchange species with one another and species turnover in a spatially explicit landscape level way, I think is a really important direction that the field can move in. Another incredibly important trend I think that needs to be followed is more rigorous validation. I was shocked to discover when I did my literature review that 40% of all process-explicit models I reviewed were not validated at all. We need to do better than this. We need to know whether these models are actually correct or not. All right, chapter 2. How can we improve the accuracy and precision of process-explicit models of human migration? You can read more about this in our paper in ecological modeling. Like I said, I did a bunch of modeling of human abundances over time for the sake of my bison models, and I found that there was a lot of uncertainty going on, and I wanted to get at why and how this could be improved. Let's return to this nice map of human range expansion. I want to draw your attention particularly to the Americas, because the expansion through the Americas is remarkably rapid. I really want to address the caveat before anyone points that out. I'm aware of the fact that there's mounting evidence of earlier migrations than 15,000 years ago. There were probably smaller migrations that occurred before this in boats. The reason why I'm focusing on the 15,000 years ago overland migration is that genetic evidence suggests that this was by far the largest wave of initial expansion into the Americas, and I'm interested in the conservation impacts on other species. So the large migrations are the ones that are going to be the most important in terms of effects on other species. But in any case, this range expansion was extraordinarily rapid. If you think about geological time, it's amazing how quickly humans got all the way to the bottom of South America. So yeah, modeling this can be really helpful in terms of understanding what's happening and to other species that are in the way of this migration. So one way that you can potentially improve these sorts of projections is through your choice of climate model. People who have done species distribution models before are probably aware of the fact that your choice of climate model greatly affects what your forecasts are. There's multiple climate models with different assumptions and parameterizations, and they have different projections about the climate. And your forecasts about what happens to a species over time can be hugely affected by which one you pick. So this is an example with the banded skipper, which is a lovely Australian butterfly. And in this study, they did a bunch of different climate model parameterizations of the range forecasts. As you can see, the forecasts are super different depending on which set of climate data are used. So the question I had was, can we pick a climate model for a process-explicit model of human range expansion that makes them more accurate? Does this have a similar large effect on the outcomes as it does in a species distribution model? To do this, I used the climate-informed spatial genetic model. As far as I know, this is the only game in town as far as it goes for process-explicit models of human range expansion. It's ultimately a genetic model. It is validated using genetic distances between sampled modern human populations, so it converges toward reconstructing correct genetic distances. So each of these hexagons is like a deme, genetically speaking. So the world in SysGem is represented as a network of these hexagons. So hexagons can exchange migrants with one another. They can grow until the carrying capacity. They can send settlers into unoccupied cells. And then, of course, each hex can be affected by net primary productivity and whether there's an ice sheet over it and whether it's underwater. Whenever you're looking at long timescales, you have to think about the ice sheets and the sea levels. Keep that in mind. So the basic methodology here is that I took approximately 5,000 optimized demographic parameter values for SysGem based on a previous study. And then I ran one set of these simulations on two different paleoclimate data sets, HAD-CM3 and Trace 21KA. And then I ran these simulations took some key outcome variables and did a random forest sensitivity analysis on the results. All right, this is where I'm going to do a quick change over to a video in a separate window, because embedded videos tend not to go so well. Okay, I'm just going to pause this for 1 second to explain some stuff. So, one of the key, you're still moving, go stop. Anyway, one of the outcome variables that I measured was time of exit from Alaska. So humans were in Alaska starting like 60,000 years ago. So one question, so the 15,000 year expansion is when they start to move out of Alaska. So time of exit from Alaska is one variable. Another variable is expansion rate in kilometers per year. So that's like how far the frontier of humans advances. So with that in mind, let's have a look at this video. You can see that for now, they're still hanging out up in Alaska, and now in Hadley, they're off. Trace is a little bit slower, but they're catching up. Ultimately, you can see there's not really that much difference between these two. Basically, the same thing is happening. It's just happening a little bit faster in Hadley. So the HAD-CM3 model was a little bit less accurate in terms of timing of exit from Alaska from what we know from the archaeological literature than the trace one, but the difference was only 700 years. In geological time, this is a pretty small difference. So here are the results of the sensitivity analysis I did on each of these outcome variables. So I was quite surprised to discover that climate model really didn't matter very much at all. It got ranked very low importance. The choice of paleoclimate model didn't really affect things very much. What had a lot more impact was demographic parameters. So colonization rate and population growth rate definitely leapt out as important variables. Colonization rate in this context, I do specifically mean the speed of occupancy of unoccupied cells. So in conclusion, I found that the choice of paleoclimate model has relatively little impact on the predictions of process-explicit model of human migration. This is a big contrast from species distribution models. Very different outcome. And it indicates that the best way to improve the accuracy and precision of these models is through more research on the paleodemography of hunter-gatherers. We had to use very broad prior distributions for these demographic parameters because so little is known. And we did use these genetic distances to validate. But I think these models could definitely be improved by knowing more about plausible ranges for these values. All right, chapter 3. How did the steppe bison become extinct in Siberia? You can read more about this in Global Ecology and Biogeography, our paper that came out last year. Meet the steppe bison. This is Blue Babe. This is a remarkably well-preserved specimen that was found in the Alaskan permafrost. The steppe bison is, evolutionarily speaking, the common ancestor of the European and American bison, which are the two living species of bison. They were much larger than European and American bison, and they were more cold adapted. Very impressive bighorns. Let's look at the past distribution of the steppe bison. So like with the other species we looked at before, they used to have a pretty large distribution. They were found kind of all around the North Pole, that sort of thing. And then by 6,000 years ago, the steppe bison became extinct in Eurasia, and they later went extinct in North America. So what I'm going to focus on here is how they became extinct in Eurasia. So to model this, I helped develop some software called PaleoPop. This is an R package that you can download. I developed it with Sean Haythorne, Stuart Brown, and my advisor, Damien Fordham. We needed to make PaleoPop because it needed to have some special features to deal with the fact that we were modeling the steppe bison from 50,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. So this is a very long time frame, and there's a lot to consider. So one important feature was a dynamic study region that changes with sea level and ice. The thing about modeling over such a long period of time is that your study region itself changes in its contours. certain cells that used to be occupiable suddenly are not anymore. So we have to keep track of all that. We worked on a paleopopulation simulator that works on generational time steps instead of yearly ones. And we worked on a results manager that's optimized for fitting all of these many outputs in a compact way. I'm going to walk you through this methodology, which I swear is not as intimidating as it looks, or I hope it will make it comprehensible. So we started with a range of different demographic models, density-dependent population models, and we kind of made a range of guesses at these using values from living bison species to give us kind of a sense. And we created possible habitat suitability maps by modeling some hypotheses based on carbon-14 dated fossils of the steppe bison and pairing that to paleoclimate data. So then once we had these ranges of possible demographic models and habitat suitability models, we did Latin hypercube sampling to really explore the parameter space and generate tens of thousands of possible scenarios. Then for each of these scenarios, we ran a paleopopulation simulation from 50,000 to 5,000 years ago. This included threats to the species, such as human hunting. That's where I used the human abundance stuff from last chapter. Climatic change, population dynamics, and dispersal of the bison. So then this produces some outputs. So there's time series of total abundance over time. Then there's these maps of spatially explicit abundance. Then using these outputs, we did what we call pattern-oriented modeling. So what we did was after each round of simulation, we would compare some key outcome variables against validation targets. These are independent observed targets that are different from the data we use to parameterize it. Then we basically throw out the vast majority of all of these nice samples we took because they don't match the validation targets. And then do another round of modeling based on the ones that do well. So it's almost like an evolutionary process in a way. So once this all stabilizes and we have a set of models that are consistently doing well on the validation targets, then we have these validated results we can have some amount of confidence in. Another thing that we did were counterfactual scenarios. You may recall me mentioning those earlier. So this is some fun stuff you can do with process-explicit models. So we have the baseline scenario, which has realistic climate change and realistic hunting. Then we did a no hunting scenario where we turned the humans off and see what happens when there's no hunting. Then we ran constant climate scenarios. That's where the climate was frozen, as it were, in the ice age, while realistic hunting continues. So looking at some results, these were our validation targets. We had location of extinction based on where the last fossils were found. We had fossil sites, so can the model reproduce presence of bison where and when we knew they were, and time of extinction. This is a timing of extinction based on an estimate based on the timing of fossils. Our models did very well on timing and location of extinction, pretty well on fossil sites, though it's sometimes a little hard to get things at the edge of the range, like over here. Here are some results from the simulation. So I'm showing you a freeze frame at 8,000 years ago, which is the estimated time of extinction based on the fossil record as it currently stands. And this black dot is kind of showing you where we are in the big deglacial thaw, right? So in the baseline scenario, our model's doing really well at reconstructing the extinction. You see this tiny little fleck in Siberia? Those are the remaining populations. There are pretty low abundances. So they go extinct, not long after this, about 7,000 years ago. But the story is pretty different if we go to the other scenarios. So if you look at the no hunting scenario, you can see that there's some refugia spread all over the northern coast of Siberia. Low abundances, but they're there. And these persist until the end of the simulation. And then if we look at the constant climate scenario, the bison are quite happy in the Siberian highlands. It's still nice and cold. They don't need to go anywhere. So they're being hunted by humans, but they are persisting pretty robustly. So this is showing that both climate change and hunting are required in order to drive the steppe bison to extinction. So in conclusion, the extinction of the steppe bison in Eurasia was caused by a synergistic combination of deglacial warming and human hunting. Another important point is that hindcasts, like the ones we did here, can make predictions about poorly sampled areas and times that might be confirmed or refuted by future studies. With this study, there was a really great example of this. So just as we were getting ready to publish this, a paper came out in Nature by Wong et al., where they, I don't know if anyone here has seen this paper, they looked at sediment cores from the permafrost and looked at environmental DNA from these sediment cores. This lets you pull out stuff that doesn't fossilize or that, you know, maybe just didn't get the chance to fossilize. And because this is a little bit more sensitive, they were able to detect the presence of steppe bison about 1,000 years past the time that was estimated from the fossil record. That actually fits our models, which we predicted an extinction 1,000 years after that, estimated from the fossil record. So that was pretty cool to have that prediction made and then backed up by a future study. So I think that kind of feedback loop with empirical findings is super important. Another important point is that species decline can begin 20,000 years before the final extinction event. When I ran these simulations, in the baseline scenario, I found that population size started to get very low, 20,000 years before the final extinction date. So that was really interesting. It means that you kind of have to take the long view to see the full story. All right, chapter 4. How did the European bison become extinct in the wild? This paper is currently in review at Proc B. Look, a charismatic megafauna. You like those? This is a living species. This is the European bison. They went extinct in the wild in 1927. And since then, there's been a remarkable conservation effort that started in the 30s and 40s to breed back the species from captive animals. And this was successful. They were reintroduced into the wild after this breeding program. They're now classified as near threatened by the IUCN. So they've come a very long way, a remarkable long way, but they still have a long way to go in order to ensure their survival into the future. Here is a rough map of the range collapse of the European bison. My work refines this map enormously, as you will see soon. But this is a rough concept of the maximum extent of the European bison. The dark green area shows their range in the medieval period in Europe, and the red shows their range in 1900. So they underwent a really dramatic range collapse, just like all the other species we looked at. This is their range now. It's very fragmented, poor connectivity. Keen eyes will note that there's several populations in Ukraine. It's estimated that about 50% of all free-living bison are in Ukraine. Probably bad. Nobody knows what's going on there. But it's a matter of pretty intense conservation concern. Their conservation is considered a priority by the European Union. So I don't want to belabor the point too much about methodology. The methodology I used for the European bison and the modeling was fairly similar to what I did for the steppe bison, which I already showed you step by step before. The things I'm going to show you are just the things I did differently this time, so that I don't have to bore you by repeating myself. So one thing I did differently was that I included land use change. If we look at Siberia from 50,000 to 5,000 years ago, there really is not very much land use change, as you can see in this snapshot from 4,000 years ago. But the European bison I modeled from 21,000 years ago up until 1870. So during that time period, there's a lot of land use change in Eurasia to consider. So here is a snapshot at 1850 over here. That's what 100 BP means in normal dates. So this land use change index just indicates how much of the land has been converted to urban agriculture or pasture. So there's a lot of that going on. So that's something that got incorporated into this model. Another big methodological difference was hunting scenarios. So like I said, I was modeling up until 1870. A big change in hunting that's occurred was that guns started to be used in Europe in around 1500. So that almost certainly changes things in terms of hunting, but I wasn't sure how much. So I explored some different scenarios of how much guns might have increased the maximum hunting rate. So I explored 11 different scenarios of how much that might have increased. There were a couple other methodological differences, but we can talk about that afterward over happy hour. So now I'm going to show you a video again. So a few things I'm going to point out. Date is down here, this 21,000 years ago, kilo annum before present. The gray areas are areas of low agreement between models. So with all this validation process, I end up with an ensemble of models, about 50, that emerge as the top models, but sometimes they don't agree with each other. So the gray means that there was some disagreement among the models. You'll also sometimes see red dots pop up. Those red dots are fossils. So they're popping up when, in accordance to when they're from. This is during the Ice Age. Ice sheets are covering a lot of this area, so the European bison are forced to the margins. It's kind of hanging out down in southern Europe. There's going to be a population here in the Caucasus this whole time. You'll notice it. So the ice is starting to melt at this point. We see some changes happening. The southern and western populations are going to start to merge soon. So this population is crawling eastward, and the southern populations are coming northward. Again, you'll see this isolated Caucasus population the whole time. This is thought to be a subspecies of European bison. Yep, there's the big merger happening in Europe. This population in Siberia is about to go extinct in a few thousand years. Yeah, it's going. There's this population that got isolated in the UK that will also die off from being disconnected. So now we've got this nice big population in Europe, but that again is isolated from this Caucasus population. Over time, you'll see this European range start to erode around the edges as more and more human pressures come to bear on them. You see the edges will get kind of dissolved away like a sugar cube in coffee. Yep, and now we end on 1500. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So here's a fun output I got from my simulations. It's a map of causes of extinction of the European bison. So the way I produced this map was that I had these counterfactual scenarios. I had one without hunting and one without land use change. So what I did was that I looked in each cell to see whether the European bison still became extinct in those counterfactuals. So in the ones where the European bison still goes extinct in those counterfactuals, I know that they became extinct because of climate change. So that's marked in green. And the ones where the European bison suddenly come back in the counterfactuals, I know they became extinct because of human pressures. The areas in blue are places that they last until 1500 in the baseline scenario, and this shows their abundance. For reference, each of these grid cells is about 75 by 85 kilometers. That gives you a little bit of a sense of what these abundances mean. And then the gray cells are cells where the European bison was never found at any point. And to look a little bit more closely at these counterfactuals, you can see the abundances are way higher in the no hunting scenario. So clearly, that had a big impact on the abundance of the European bison. Less of an impact in the no land use change scenario. Another interesting finding is a kind of spatial sorting effect. So you see in the no hunting scenario, relative to here, the range expands to the north and east, while in the no land use change scenario, it expands a lot to the south and west. See? So there's different pressures on the European bison from different directions. And here's the results from the hunting scenarios. So I used some historical records you may have heard me mention. I'm incredibly fortunate to have found a census of the European bison in both remaining populations in 1870. There was one available for the population in Poland and one available for the population in the Caucasus. So I have a total population size, historically speaking, for the European bison in 1870. And what I did is I looked at these different hunting scenarios of increase in hunting due to guns after 1500. And as you can see, only an increase of 30% in maximum hunting rate is needed to match the true population size in 1870. So that seems like a fairly realistic possible increase in hunting due to guns. So to interpret some things about this study, first of all, deglacial warming eroded the edges of the bison's range. So you saw that the climate change caused areas are more toward the edges, right? And that forced them into the center of the range where the human population was higher and brought with it all these different human pressures. Another point is that land use change had only a minor impact on the range of the European bison. Hunting had a much bigger impact. Another is that the threats that drove the European bison to extinction in the past are the same threats the species faces now. So you had rapid warming impacting them, you had land use change impacting them, and you had hunting impacting them. And there's a real concern right now with the conflict in Ukraine that the breakdown of law and the breakdown of the government means that poaching may become a factor again. This is part of what caused their extinction in 1927 was poaching during World War I. Another important point about reintroductions. There's active reintroduction that's happening now to try to reintroduce the European bison to its previous range. But it hasn't necessarily taken into account more detailed considerations of what happened in the past. So the really important point is that the bison should not be introduced into areas that are marked gray or green on this map. Gray cells are areas where the European bison has never lived. And the green areas are ones where it became extinct due to the climate being unsuitable, and it will only become more unsuitable in those places in the future. The places where we have the best shot of reintroducing the European bison are the ones where they became extinct due to human pressures. I emphasize this because there are currently ongoing reintroduction projects in the gray and green areas. Conclusions. Just to revisit these research questions so you can remember the journey we've been on. 1, how can process-explicit models be used to conserve biodiversity? 2, how can we improve the accuracy of process-explicit models of human migration? 3, how did the steppe bison become extinct in Siberia? And 4, how did the European bison become extinct in the wild? One important conclusion I've drawn from all of this is that past threats are present threats. The threats that have affected the species that I've been looking at are rapid warming in northern Eurasia, that's happening now, human exploitation, that's happening now, and land use change, that's also happening now. Another point is the importance of diverse data sources. This study would not have been possible without all of the new data that has become available recently. I used paleoclimate data from multiple paleoclimate models. I used carbon-14 dated fossils that have recently been digitized by museums. And the more that museums digitize their collections, the more of these fossils become available for ecological modelers to use and understand the past. I used genetic evidence from ancient DNA, sequences available on GenBank. I could put them together and look at trends in effective population size of bison over time. Historical records. A lot of this information that I got on historical records of European bison were due to digitized records from the Smithsonian that were extremely helpful to me. And the data set I used on land use change, where I showed you those nice maps, those data became available during my PhD. It was in 2020 that was published. So really, it's a very rapidly evolving data landscape. Another point is the importance of long timescales. This is a time series of the simulated population size of the steppe bison. This is the extinction time as predicted by the fossil record. And you can see that the decline began 20,000 years before. The very low population sizes began 20,000 years before. So you really have to take the long view in order to understand how extinction occurs sometimes. You wouldn't get the whole picture if you started looking here. So you might be wondering, how am I bringing this to Cary? Because none of this has anything to do with disease ecology. Well, it does have something to do with the disease ecology, and that the biogeography of disease is very important. Where it occurs and when, and how that changes over time. But essentially, I'm bringing this methodology to disease ecology. So I am building process-explicit models of disease transmission in wildlife. So here's some preliminary stuff that I've done with an avian disease. So here is a process-explicit model of this disease in a population. I introduced one infected adult at day 0, and let's look at what happened. So there's an outbreak that occurs 200 days later in this population. So I'd like to just acknowledge people who've helped me throughout my PhD. My 2 advisors, Damien and Karsten at Australia and Denmark. My collaborator, Rob Colwell, who some people here know, I think. There's my PhD coordinator, David. My fellow PhD students who also did this wild journey from Denmark to Australia, Nick and Elisabetta. My collaborators, Barry Brook at the University of Tasmania, Sean Haythorne at the University of Melbourne. And no PhD can survive without the postdocs in their lab helping them out. And for me, that was Stuart Brown and Hannah Owens. Thanks, everyone. And I'm happy to take your questions, both now and later during happy hour. So
much, July. Any questions? I'm trying to navigate this.
Oh, all the way in the back. Or that's you. I think you're all the way in the back from my perspective.
The bit again where you were talking about the 30% piece in hunting being sufficient to whatever kind of match up to the data prediction. I was thinking I had my fisheries hat on, and I think a fisheries person would think partly about that change in the available gear, the ability to gun. To what extent did that change the amount of effort in hunting, and to what extent did it change the efficiency of pointing into effort? And I think we could maybe constrain that a little bit, right? Because there are existing hunts that people do both primitive weapons and guns. And so you might be able to take something like that as an estimate of, well, what's the efficiency gain from a gun? And so I don't know whether it's useful or not. You might be able to sit down. Okay, well, how much of it is an efficiency gain and how much is as a gun? You get a nice gun out and go nice.
No, I mean, I think that's a good point. So there was this hunting function that I used to simulate hunting. So it had a certain, well, there were a bunch of, but I basically used like a range of possible hunting functions. It's this whole methodology I used with like all these different scenarios and finding which ones are correct. But I had a particular range of hunting functions I was using, right? And the ones that came out the best in the pattern-oriented modeling are the ones that I used for this. But the thing is, I didn't change the hunting function over time. The hunting function was always the same. And I think you could argue that the fundamental shape of the hunting function itself, which is kind of what you're getting at, might change instead of just lifting the ceiling on the hunting function, which is what I did here, right? So I think that's a good point. And also, I mean, that same criticism could be made of the steppe bison work I did, in the sense that hunting technology was hardly static from 50,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago either. So it is definitely an oversimplification to have the same hunting function throughout, when hunting technology doesn't just increase the maximum, but could change the very shape of the hunting function itself.
Yeah, and history spoke about that a lot, even over much like decades. Just to like remember slow game. There, whether they get one bison or zero bison.
Evan?
Yeah, really.
Thanks.
You mentioned the human expansion of colonization, a really strong effect. And I was curious about tendency to geography. At least in shorter time scale, the European colonization current location there, that was initially driven by road waves or very often water waves. Is that something that's included in these types of longer scale models, or is that
July, could you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question for Zoom. Thanks for reminding me. So Evan was asking about the colonization rate parameter in the human range expansion model, SysGem, like what affects that colonization rate in the landscape, right? So in this model in SysGem, the only thing that changes the colonization rate is kind of the quality of habitat being colonized. So basically, you get a higher colonization rate if it's a high quality habitat. So that's really the only thing that affects it. There is a new version of SysGem that's being worked on by the lab that created it. This is the Andrea and Monica's lab at Cambridge. They're working on a new version that I've seen in operation, the prototype, but I wasn't allowed to use because it was still a prototype. But they're working on a new version that incorporates topography into the colonization rate. So it's taking into account, altitude and that sort of thing, riverbeds, all that sort of stuff into the colonization rate, which I think is a really good idea that could really get more realistic outcomes. The simulations I saw were really interesting. It kind of the way it ended up affecting things was not necessarily in the way I expected. So it's kind of famously like when you have especially the dispersal to the tropics, so the stuff that's going into South America, you could have very stable climates if you kind of stay in the same elevation band in like along a mountain range. So in a way, the mountain ranges were actually facilitated dispersal, not blocked it, because in those simulations, the humans were kind of using a consistent band of altitude to move down the Andes. So some interesting findings from that new version that's coming out. So I'm excited to see the paper that comes out of that. I don't know precisely where that is in its evolution, but I will definitely keep an eye out for it because I think it's, a cool new addition to that. Jazz?
So I wonder how you think
Yeah, I mean, to properly do it, I shouldn't even just do it for guns. Like I said before, there's been other innovations in hunting over time. Guns are not the only change. So, I think realistically, I would want to do it with not just guns, but also, get a sense from archaeology of what the major innovations are. It just was a little hard to research this sometimes because archaeologists love using terms like Gravettian instead of saying how many years ago was it. But it's but all of these kinds of innovations, could impact not just the maximum hunting rate, like I said, but the shape of the hunting function itself. So, I think a more accurate model would definitely include multiple technological innovations. So perhaps there would be kind of a changing, maximum hunting rate throughout the whole thing, depending on technological changes.
I'm just going to chime in with a question from the audience online.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And this person is asking that when you were doing the pattern-oriented validation in your models, and you mentioned rerunning them after eliminating the mismatches, did you resample the parameter space at this point in order to?
Yeah. So basically, to get into a little bit more detail about this, I was essentially creating posterior distributions from approximate Bayesian computation, converging toward the validation target. So tossing out mismatches is a little bit of an oversimplification, right? There's a whole algorithm used to create a posterior distribution in a Bayesian style. So then I take these posterior distributions and fit a new distribution to that, right? And then use that as a prior distribution for the next round of modeling. So, it's not just using little points of like this set is accurate and this set is accurate. It's a distribution. Yeah. Oh, Shannon.
Thank you. Really interesting work. I have some questions about. I think it's really cool that you're focusing in on population size and abundance. And I guess I'm curious how you got that, right? So how are the fossil records, for instance, in the bison studies that you did informing population abundance? And how much are they informing them versus kind of current understanding of demography and population growth?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so Shannon was asking with the spatially explicit abundances produced of the bison, how does the fossil record inform the estimates of abundance? The answer is they don't deform it at all. The fossils have no effect. I've seen people try to estimate abundance based on fossils. I'm extremely skeptical of this methodology. Just because you find more fossils of an organism in an area doesn't mean it was more abundant in that area. It just means that perhaps that species fossilized better in that area, or maybe there was a river that perfectly carried skulls of a certain size to that particular location, right? So I think it's really dangerous to try to use fossils to estimate abundance. The abundances were so like I basically estimated a like ballpark of range of possible densities based on knowledge from living bison species in the case of the steppe bison, right? So that gives you a range of how many there could be. And then ultimately what gets chosen in that range is kind of a result of the pattern-oriented modeling. So there has to be enough abundance in that area for the bison to be there in the places where there were fossils, because that's something that's selected for in the pattern-oriented modeling process, but a small enough abundance that they can become extinct at the time they're supposed to become extinct. You know what I mean? So it's really just a combination of a range of plausible values from modern demography, plus the sort of different selection forces I introduced into the evolutionary process, as it were. So yeah, fossils for abundance, bad. Don't agree.
Time for one more question, I think, before we call it.
All right, Jane?
You know, the joy of megafauna, it was there and it's present. What about with your disease work looking forward? You know, you're going to have this difficulty with it's present, but is it actually infecting? Is it actually, you know, when it's so special? So I'm just curious how you're going to approach that layer of complication.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in a lot of cases, you do have incredibly scarce data in disease ecology, as I'm sure Barbara could tell you in great length, complaining about.
Well, not as sparse as what you had.
Well, yeah, paleo stuff is pretty sparse, right? I mean, this has given me some experience working with sparse data. I mean, like with the steppe bison, I think in total I had like 150 fossils over the course of 45,000 years. It's not much. It's not much at all. So I have worked with sparse data. However, I currently don't have this problem. If anything, I have the opposite. I'm currently doing process-explicit modeling of the house finch conjunctivitis outbreak, on which there is an enormous amount of research. I'm drowning in data. I have hundreds of thousands of occurrences. The symptoms of the disease are easily observed by bird watchers. I have so much information. So I'm completely fine as far as that goes. But it's definitely something that I may have to tackle in future systems, but I've done it before.
Great. Well, thank you so much for an awesome talk, Dr. Pilowsky. We're going to be together for lunch, so please feel free to schedule one-on-ones or come up to July at lunch and at happy hour today at 4 o'clock. Thanks so much.